Look around this room. Look at the cheap beige couch. Look at the cardboard boxes that have been sitting unpacked for 6 months. Look at the bare white walls. There isn't a single photograph in this entire apartment. There are no school pictures on a mantle. There are no anniversary portraits. There is nothing to prove that I ever had a life, a family, or a home. And that is exactly what I deserve. My name is Garrett. I am 48 years old. 2 years ago, if you asked anyone in the town of Cedar Ridge who I was, they would have told you I was a good man. I was a regional sales director for a medical supply company. I was married to a beautiful, fiercely intelligent woman named June. We had a 14-year-old son named Landon. I coached Landon's traveling baseball team. I grilled burgers for the neighborhood on the 4th of July. I paid my taxes. I went to church. I thought I was the ultimate protector. I thought it was my God-given duty to shield my family and my property from the dangers of the outside world. But I am speaking to Marcus's archive today to confess a terrifying truth. I wasn't a protector. I was a paranoid, entitled, racist monster. And it only took 3 minutes on a Saturday afternoon for the entire world to see it. I am telling this story because there are thousands of men out there exactly like me. White, middle-class fathers who sit in their comfortable living rooms, convinced that they are the good guys. We tell ourselves that we aren't racist because we don't use slurs. But racism isn't just about the words you say. Sometimes it's about who you instantly criminalize in your own mind. It's about who you believe is inherently dangerous, and who you believe has no right to exist in your space. To understand how I destroyed my life, you have to understand the bubble I was living in. Cedar Ridge was a wealthy, overwhelmingly white, gated subdivision, and like every neighborhood of its kind, it had a private Facebook group. This group was moderated by a woman named Petra. Petra was a busybody who spent her entire life staring out her front blinds, reporting suspicious activity. For years I read these posts about strange vehicles parked on the street, posts about unfamiliar teenagers walking on the sidewalks. The language was always coded, but the implication was always the same. They do not belong here. They are coming to take what is ours. When you consume that kind of paranoia every single day, it creates an insidious echo chamber. You start to view the world outside your gates as a war zone. You start to believe that you are under constant siege. You stop seeing people, and you start seeing threats. The match that lit the powder keg was struck on the afternoon of September 18th, 2021. It was a crisp, clear Saturday. I was in the garage, organizing my tools. June was inside the house, paying bills. Suddenly, my son Landon walked up the driveway. He was in tears, hyperventilating. I dropped my wrench and ran over to him. I asked him what was wrong. Landon told me that he had been down at the community park, playing basketball with some friends. He said he set his brand new iPhone 13, a phone I had just bought him for his birthday 2 weeks prior, on the bleachers. When he went to get a drink of water, he turned back around, and the phone was gone. He didn't see anyone take it. He didn't know what happened. He was just a terrified kid who thought his dad was going to yell at him for losing a $1,000 piece of technology. But I didn't yell at Landon. My mind instantly bypassed logic and went straight to righteous fury. Someone had stolen from my son. Someone had entered my community, targeted my flesh and blood, and taken what belonged to us. I felt a visceral, blinding adrenaline rush. The protector instinct kicked into overdrive. "Get in the house," I told Landon, my voice completely cold. I pulled out my own phone and opened the Find My tracking app. Because I was linked to Landon's family account, I could see the GPS ping of his phone. The little green dot was moving. It wasn't at the park anymore. It was moving slowly down Cedar Boulevard, heading toward the front entrance of the subdivision. At that exact moment, my neighbor, a man named Blaine, walked over from his yard. Blaine was a guy who loved neighborhood drama. He saw my face, saw the app, and asked what was happening. When I told him Landon's phone had been stolen, Blaine's eyes lit up with the same toxic, vigilante excitement I was feeling. "They're walking out of the neighborhood," Blaine said, pointing toward the street. "Let's go get them." I didn't call the police. That was my first fatal mistake. In my arrogant, entitled mind, calling the police would take too long. By the time a squad car arrived, the thief would be gone. I believed I had the absolute right to dispense justice myself. Blaine and I jumped into my heavy-duty Ford pickup truck. I threw it into gear, my tires squealing on the concrete, and we sped down the suburban streets, my eyes glued to the tracking app on my phone. The dot was nearing the edge of the subdivision. We turned the corner onto the main boulevard, and I slammed on the brakes. Walking on the sidewalk, completely alone, was a black teenager. He was wearing a gray hoodie and carrying a backpack. He was looking down, tapping on a smartphone in his hand. I found out later his name was Tyson. He was 15 years old. He didn't live in our subdivision. He lived in an apartment complex 2 miles away. He had walked into Cedar Ridge that afternoon to drop off a science project at a classmate's house and was simply walking back home. But as I sat in the driver's seat of my truck, staring at this 15-year-old child through the windshield, I didn't see a high school student. I didn't see an innocent kid walking home. My brain, conditioned by years of subtle, quiet racism, did a horrifying, instantaneous calculation. Black teenager plus hoodie plus holding a phone equals thief. I didn't consider the fact that millions of teenagers hold phones. I didn't consider that the GPS dot on my app was notoriously inaccurate by a radius of several hundred feet. I saw a black boy in a white neighborhood, and I decided, without a shred of evidence, that he was guilty. "That's him," I growled to Blaine. "He's got it right in his hand." I hit the gas. I swerved my heavy truck violently across the lane, cutting off the sidewalk and blocking Tyson's path. I slammed the truck into park, threw open my door, and charged at him. Tyson froze. He looked up, his eyes wide with absolute terror, as a massive, angry adult man sprinted at him. "Give me the phone!" I screamed, my voice echoing off the quiet suburban houses. Tyson took a step back, clutching the phone to his chest. "What?" "Man, this is my phone. Get away from me." "Don't lie to me, you little punk," I roared. "I tracked it. I know you stole it from my son at the park. Hand it over right now." Tyson was shaking. He was a child, completely isolated, facing down a grown man twice his size. "I didn't steal anything. I'm just walking home." I didn't listen. I didn't want to listen. I wanted a confrontation. I closed the distance between us, reached out, and violently grabbed Tyson by the collar of his hoodie. I yanked him forward, nearly pulling him off his feet. "Help!" Tyson screamed, his voice cracking with pure panic. "Somebody help me! Let me go!" I pinned him against the side of my truck, reaching for the hand that held the phone. He was struggling, crying, begging me to stop. Blaine was standing a few feet away, yelling at the kid to just hand it over. It was in that chaotic, violent moment that a bystander intervened. A man named Floyd, who was walking his dog across the street, saw the commotion. Floyd didn't just watch. He pulled out his phone and hit record. Floyd yelled out, "Hey, let go of that kid. I'm calling the cops." Hearing the word cops only emboldened my delusion. "Call 'em!" I yelled back, still pinning Tyson to the truck. "This little thug stole my son's phone. I'm holding them right here until they arrive." I actually believed I was the hero. I genuinely thought the police were going to show up, pat me on the back, and arrest this terrified child. I held Tyson captive against the cold metal of my truck for 6 excruciating minutes. He stopped fighting and just stood there, sobbing silently, completely traumatized by my physical assault. The police arrived with their sirens blaring. 2 officers stepped out of the cruiser. I finally let go of Tyson. I stepped back, adjusting my shirt, acting completely smug. I pointed at the boy and said, "Officers, he stole my son's iPhone 13. He has it right there in his hand. I caught him trying to leave the neighborhood." The older officer, a veteran cop, looked at me, looked at the sobbing teenager, and then looked at the phone in Tyson's trembling hand. "Son," the officer said calmly, "is that your phone?" "Yes, sir," Tyson choked out, wiping tears from his face. "Can you unlock it for me?" Tyson nodded. He lifted the phone up to his face. The screen illuminated, the Face ID recognized him instantly, and the phone unlocked to a home screen picture of Tyson and his mother. The air left my lungs. The entire world seemed to stop spinning. "Sir," the officer said, turning to look at me, his eyes narrowing with a dangerous intensity, "that is his phone." "No," I stammered, pulling out my own phone, my hand suddenly shaking. "No, the tracking app, it said it was right here. It was pinging right here." I opened the Find My app. The little green dot was no longer on the street. It was pinging directly over my own house. My phone buzzed in my hand. It was a text message from my wife, June. "Found Landon's phone. It slipped between the cushions of the basement sofa. Everything is fine." I felt a cold, sickening wave of absolute horror wash over me. I looked at Tyson. I looked at the red marks on his neck where I had grabbed his hoodie. I had physically assaulted a child. I had terrorized an innocent 15-year-old boy simply because he was black and walking down the street. The police did not pat me on the back. The officer told me to turn around and put my hands on the hood of my truck. Right there, in front of Blaine, in front of Floyd's recording camera, and in front of the traumatized teenager I had just assaulted, the officer slapped cold steel handcuffs on my wrists. I was arrested for simple assault and false imprisonment of a minor. But the legal charges were nothing compared to the nuclear bomb that went off the next morning. Floyd uploaded the video to social media. By Sunday evening, it had crossed 10 million views. The internet dubbed me the Cedar Ridge Vigilante. The video showed every ugly, terrifying second. It showed me swerving my truck, jumping out, screaming at a child, and physically pinning him against a vehicle while he cried for help. The destruction of my life was swift, merciless, and absolute. On Monday morning, before I even posted bail, the medical supply company where I had worked for 12 years terminated me. They issued a public statement condemning my vile, racist, and violent behavior. When I finally got out of the county jail and walked into my beautiful suburban home, June was standing in the kitchen. She wasn't crying. She looked at me as if I were a stranger who had broken into her house. "June," I pleaded, stepping toward her. "It was a mistake. I thought he had the phone. I panicked." She backed away from me. "You didn't panic, Garrett. You hunted a child. You saw a black boy and you turned into an animal. Landon saw the video. He threw up in the bathroom. He is terrified of you." I tried to apologize. I begged. I fell to my knees in my own kitchen. But you cannot unring a bell like that. You cannot show your family the monster lurking inside you and expect them to ever feel safe around you again. June packed her bags, took Landon, and moved in with her sister. She filed for divorce 2 weeks later. She cited my violent public arrest as grounds for sole physical custody. The judge granted it. The criminal justice system wasn't done with me either. Tyson's family, rightfully, demanded justice. The local district attorney, facing immense public pressure, threw the book at me. I was facing real prison time. My high-priced defense attorney told me that if we went to trial, a jury would crucify me based on the video alone. I had no choice but to take a plea deal. I pled guilty to felony aggravated assault. Because I had no prior criminal record, the judge suspended a 3-year prison sentence, but he placed me on 5 years of strict probation. I was ordered to pay $20,000 in restitution and fines, complete 500 hours of community service, and attend mandatory anger management and racial bias counseling. I became a convicted felon. I lost my house and the divorce settlement to ensure June and Landon were taken care of. I drained my entire life savings paying legal fees. I couldn't get a job in corporate sales anymore because any background check immediately pulled up my felony record and the viral video of my assault. Which brings me here, to this cheap, miserable apartment on the other side of the state. I work the night shift in the warehouse of a hardware store. I pack boxes from midnight to 8 a.m. in total silence, avoiding eye contact with anyone. I haven't spoken to my son Landon in 2 years. June forwards me his report cards via email, but that is the extent of my contact with my own child. He is 16 now, driving a car, going to dances, growing up without a father, because his father was a racist who couldn't control his own prejudice. I spend my days sitting on this cheap couch, staring at the blank walls. The silence in this room is deafening. It forces you to sit with your own thoughts. It forces you to look at the exact moment you ruined everything. To Tyson, I know you will carry the trauma of that afternoon for the rest of your life. I know that because of me, you will never feel completely safe walking down a street again. I stole your innocence, and I terrorized you over a piece of plastic. I am a broken, empty man, and I am so profoundly, deeply sorry for the violence I inflicted upon you. And to the men watching this, the suburban dads, the guys who think they are the protectors of their neighborhoods, look at my face. Look at these empty walls. Racism is a loaded gun, and when you let paranoia pull the trigger, the bullet doesn't just destroy the innocent person standing in front of you. It ricochets. It destroys your marriage. It destroys your career. It rips your children away from you. I thought I was defending my family, but all I did was show them and the entire world exactly who I was. I am completely alone, and I will die completely alone. And the hardest, most agonizing truth I have to live with every single day is knowing that I deserve it.